Well, hey everyone, welcome to Walking with Disciples. We've been on a journey through the book of Acts for the last several weeks, and we're in the end of the book of Acts, meaning that when we talk about the overarching story, the roller coaster ride that is the book of Acts, we're in the last stages, and we find ourselves in chapter 21, and Paul has come back to Jerusalem after all of his journeys. And he knows that something big is going to happen. He knows he's going to be arrested, be handed over to the Gentiles. And so we found out yesterday that the Jews start to get upset, specifically the ones from Ephesus. We kind of know, if you've been with me, you know about the riots that happened in Ephesus over Paul's teaching and everything that was happening there. And so we pick up in Acts chapter 21, as Paul is being brought into the barracks. Remember, he was handcuffed between two guards. It says that he had two chains on him, so he was handcuffed between two guards. And things had gotten so bad that they actually were carrying him because the Jews were trying to still beat Paul. And it says, as Paul was about to be brought in the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And it's interesting because this tells us about what was going on in that history in that area. He says, "Well, do you speak Greek? Oh, you must be." This is the tribune talking to Paul. "Oh, you must be that Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness." Now, I think there's a cool story, historical story we don't know about there, and I would kind of like to know personally about these 4,000 assassins and how that worked out. But Paul replies to say, "Hey, no, I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen." So he's already telling him, "Hey, I'm a citizen of Tarsus." And he says, "I just want permission to speak." And so that's where we get into Acts chapter 22. That goes to the end of chapter 21. So we get to 22, and I want you to notice something right off the bat, that when Paul speaks, it sounds a lot like Stephen or Peter, right? And they always do the same thing. And they start out, and he says to them, brothers and fathers. He immediately says to them, us. That's what he's saying. A lot of respect there, and saying, "Hey, I'm going to talk," and he speaks to them in Hebrew, not in Greek, but in Hebrew, to let them know that I am part of you. And it says that when they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they actually quieted down even farther. And he begins to talk about himself and tells his story. And so the first thing I want you to recognize, again, and I've said it and I'm continuing to say it, that when you and I get the opportunity to talk to people, we need to talk to them in the us term and not the them term, right? That when I talk, it's about us. It's like, I've heard preachers before, and sometimes, I won't say a lot of times, sometimes I'll hear preachers and they're always saying you all need to change, you all need to do this. And I've really tried to change the language and say we need to do this, and I really feel like, for me personally, that what I preach, what I bring, I'm always bringing things that God has dealt with me on, and that he wants me to talk to us about, right? And so it makes a difference, because it's not Paul at this point telling them you. He's saying us, okay? And the other part is, it's very interesting. I'm not going to read all of 22 because that's kind of what we're covering today. But he begins to tell his story. He starts off in the very beginning. "Hey, I'm a Jew, and I was taught by Gamaliel." And if you don't know who that is, go back into the Walking with Disciples. Read on in the first parts of Acts, where we hear about the story of Paul, the story of him at the martyrdom of Stephen, right? The story of Paul. And that'll help us, because there's some really cool things, some insights into who Paul was. But that's where he starts. And then he goes, "And I was about persecuting the way." In fact, verse 4, that's where he's at. I was persecuting the way. The way, again, is Christianity, right? What you and I consider Christians today, they really refer to as the way, which I just love, man. If I had my way, we'd say I'm part of the way, right? there's one way, and that's the only way to do it. And how we act, how we talk, how we think is one way, right? He says, I was all about persecuting the way, right? And I did everything I could. In fact, I got orders to go to Damascus. So again, he's telling his story. He says, but he goes, on the way to Damascus, all of a sudden I fell to the ground, and I saw this bright light and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? He says, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. He saw this light, and he goes, and then the voice told me to rise up and go to Damascus. And so I go to Damascus. And then in verse 12, he says, and I go to this one guy, Ananias. And again, this is what he says. Listen, because he says, and one Ananias in verse 12, a devout man, according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there. Why does he say that? What do you remember what he's accused of? He's accused of what Stephen was accused of as well, which was basically blasphemy against the law. That Paul was teaching Jews that they don't have to follow the law. And he said, hey, I went to this guy that is a devout Jew according to the law, and the other Jews around him know him as such, right? He's saying, so what you guys are talking about is false. I've got backing here. And he talked about how Ananias told him about Jesus Christ and how he was healed. And then it says in verse 17, he says, then I returned to Jerusalem. And if you remember, if you go back in the early stories of Paul in the book of Acts, we talk about how from Ananias he goes to Jerusalem, and just kind of the strife there as people wonder what's going on, right? This guy who's persecuting us now wants to be part of us. And he said that he fell, in verse 17, he says, I fell into a trance, very similar to the Peter example, right? Remember Peter and the sheet falling down, right? That he fell into a trance. And in the trance, it said, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept the testimony about me, your testimony about me, right? And he said, but Lord, they know. This is Paul talking to God. He said, but Lord, they know about all the stuff I did. Now I've completely changed. I've done a 180. I've completely changed. They're going to listen to me. But Jesus says to him, he says in verse 21, it says, and he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. This is where, in verse 22, this is where the Jews lose it at that point, right? This is up to this point, up to this word, they listened to him. But once that happened, they said, we got to get this guy, this fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. They were ready to kill him. Now, I think the big point out of this whole story is how Paul is speaking to the people. Not only is it a us type concept, but he goes through what you and I really should go through when we want to share what God has done in our life. He goes through, this is who I was, right? This is what happened to me, and this is who I am now. He said, before knowing Christ, I persecuted Christ. I persecuted the way. I was a zealot. I was zealous. I had so much passion, right, for God, that I would imprison and beat the people that preach Jesus. But then I met Jesus in this moment, and this is what Jesus did. And now I've gone all over, and this is what God has done for me. And you and I believe this is such a great formula for us, that when we share, we are sharing the same thing. We're saying, this is what I was like before Jesus. This is what Jesus did to me, and this is who I am now. And guess what? They're not all going to like it. In fact, these guys hated it. They're like, we're going to kill you. And it gets really bad, right? Because they're flinging dust in their cloaks. And the tribune, he basically says, okay, get Paul out of here. And what we're going to do is we're going to flog him, right? We're going to whip him until he tells us what's going on. Because again, they're speaking in Hebrew, and so they wouldn't have totally understood what was happening. But then what's interesting to me is they stretch him out, and this part of the scripture kind of helps us understand the journey to Rome and why Paul ends up going to Rome and what ends up happening to him. Because it says that they get stretched out, and he looks at the centurion and he says to him, hey, is it lawful for you to flog a man who's a Roman citizen? See, the Greeks, the earlier civilization, the Greek civilization, which plays a part in in the Roman civilization, but the Greek civilization was all about learning, philosophy, and art, right? But the Roman civilization was about games and about politics, the judicial system that was created there. And so Paul understood that. He said, I'm a Roman citizen, and you cannot execute anything on me until I've been condemned, right? So the centurion hears this, tell the tribune. The tribune asks Paul, hey, are you really a citizen? And he says to them, he says to Paul, I paid for my citizenship. So what about you? Paul says, I didn't have to pay for it. I was born a citizen, which puts him at a whole nother light. And it stops everything else from happening. They immediately withdraw what they're doing, right? And get him because they realized that Paul is a citizen and they had bound him. They had done something illegal at that point. So they begin to treat him a little nicer. And this really helps Paul out as we go farther. So over the next couple of days, we're going to walk with Paul through his journey, right? We're going to see shipwrecks. We're going to see other things that happen. And it's a really interesting story if we follow along and see the hand of God and the providence of God when things are going wrong. So love you guys. We'll talk to you tomorrow. We're going to talk about Paul before the council, and we'll get into from 22 into chapter 23. All right, let's